Soon enough, the four of us were in contact again. We didn't tour in back of the solo albums. We were talking about meeting in New York to record a new album. This one we decided to call Dynasty.
The return of Kiss. The return of Kiss. Don't miss the return of Kiss. It's the album you've waited 2 years to hear. Kiss Dynasty. It's the hot new, all-new album from Casablanca. Kiss Dynasty.
Among the people I worked with on my solo LP were 3 girls and a guy called Desmond Child and Rouge, who sang background vocals on Move On. The first song we wrote together was The Fight, and it ended up on their debut album in 1978. Then, in early 1979, we worked on another one. It started after a night I spent at Studio 54, the famous New York nightclub. I had heard all these 126 beats per minute songs and listened to the lyrics and thought, gee, I can do that. I went home and set a drum machine to 126 beats per minute and sat down and started I Was Made for Lovin' You. It's funny that some Kiss fans think the song has a sanitized connotation of disco because it was written in a musical whorehouse. Studio 54 was a den of iniquity. It was sordid to a level and degree that I wasn't completely comfortable with. It was hardcore debauchery, sexual relations between everybody and anybody, and drugs everywhere. It was beyond me, but I loved going there to dance. Nobody at Studio 54 wore a white suit and danced like John Travolta. I could go down there in jeans and a t-shirt and dance. Sometimes I'd go there on a Saturday night and not leave until the next morning. I'd buy the Sunday New York Times and read the paper in bed after one last dance with a woman I took home. The music at Studio 54 was all about living in the moment, about having a great time, and so my song began like that too. Tonight, I'm going to give it all to you. Desmond helped with the verses of the song, and eventually, when we went back into the studio to work on another Kiss album, Dynasty, the producer of that album, Vinnie Poncia, helped with the chorus.
Dynasty and Unmasked, 1979-1980. Dynasty was recorded in New York City with Vinnie Poncia, who had been Peter's producer for his solo album. Paul and I had met with Vinnie at Bill Aucoin's suggestion, in part to show Peter that we thought well of his record and to bring him back into the fold. By that time, Peter was our biggest liability because he had become dependent on chemicals. Ironically, Vinnie decided that even though he produced Peter's record, he didn't think Peter was good enough to drum on a Kiss record. Peter was not qualified to make any judgments about material or arrangements, he said. In Vinnie Poncia's estimation, Peter was close to tone deaf and didn't play drums very well. times I have reassessed my criticisms of Ace and Peter. Sometimes I have to remind myself that everybody has their cross to bear. If I were Ace or Peter, I would find Gene Simmons very difficult to take.
Bill Aucoin brought in Vinny, who had produced Peter's solo album, to appease Peter. By this point, we were stuck in an ongoing yo-yoing process with Ace and Peter. Are they in or out? Can we keep this going? Bill and Sean Delaney's relationship was fraying at the same time. Sean was sent off to work on a few of Bill's other bands, and then he just disappeared. We basically never saw him again once he and Bill split up. So Bill needed Vinny to be the peacemaker. We found out later that anyone hired to work with us at this time got briefed by Bill about what you could and couldn't say to each guy. He made sure we were insulated in this artificial world where nobody ruffled our feathers. People were told what we each liked, what offended each of us, what we each needed to hear. People were paid to tell us what we wanted to hear, and it was hard to make a distinction between motive and heartfelt opinion. We were in an Elvis bubble. People literally held open doors for us. Someone opened the door at the studio, and there was always a catered meal. Bill knew us inside and out. He knew how to placate each one of us and keep us happy. That is a manager's job, particularly when confronted with 4 people as volatile and combustible as we were at the time. But those people were enablers too. Nobody wanted the gravy train to stop.
When I recall days in the city, and I think back, oh what a pity, remembering how it wasn't pretty, everyday life in the city. Out in the street, we had to take it, with friends around, we couldn't fake it, luck wasn't there, we had to make it, hanging out down in the city. The hard times are dead and gone, but the hard times have made me strong, and the hard times have made me see that the hard times ain't where I wanna be.
To Vinny's credit, though, he didn't want Peter to play on Dynasty despite their relationship. For Peter, Vinny was a buddy. But for Vinny, this was a job, and Peter was no longer capable of playing what was asked for and needed. So Vinny brought in Anton Fig to play the drums. Anton had been in an Aucoin-managed band called Spider and had played on Ace's solo LP. He later went on to play in David Letterman's house band. We worked out a deal. Anton was paid well, but we weren't paying for secrecy. Rumors did swirl that Peter wasn't on the album, but we never felt the need to address them. We never thought about actually kicking Peter out, at least not yet. For now, it would remain the 4 of us, as always.
I've never been high, except in a dentist chair, and I don't have much use for small talk. Whenever I spoke to Ace and Peter, it was to get information: who, what, why, when, where, and how. They just didn't deal well with that. We would have numerous meetings before a tour or recording session, and they just couldn't sit still. They'd be cracking jokes and throwing food at each other, and every time at the end of the meeting they would ask me, "What was that about? What were you saying?" Or a day later they would ask, "Okay, when are we going to talk about the album?" And I would have to explain that we had talked about it, and that they had agreed to certain terms. Nothing would stick. Ace and Peter didn't take notes, didn't read memos. It was a bull in the china shop situation. They would come into a room not knowing where anything was and figured that whatever was going to happen was going to happen. This was always a problem, but in 1979 the stakes were much higher. By that time, Kiss was a big, fat, bloated beast. We each had our own security guard. Culturally, the band reached its peak around 1979. We topped the Gallup poll as top rock band 3 years in a row, from 1977 to 1979. Number 2 was the Beatles, then the Bee Gees, then Led Zeppelin. We were so much a part of the cultural landscape, so much a part of what people thought of when they thought about rock and roll, it was hard to imagine being any bigger.
Is it my fortune or my fame? Is it my money or my name?
With Vinny at the helm, the album wasn't really a rock album. But then again, we weren't really a rock band anymore. We were a bunch of rich guys who lacked a primal spirit. Of course, we also never felt we had to play by anybody else's rules. What was musically acceptable to us broadened over time. For some people, it was fine that we did things our way, until we didn't do things their way. That constituted a betrayal.
I've been up and down, I've been all around. I was mystified, almost terrified. But late at night, I still hear you call my name. I've been on my own, I've been all alone. I was hypnotized, I felt paralyzed. But late at night, I still want you just the same. I've been a gambler, but I'm nobody's fool. And I sure know something, sure know something. You showed me things they never taught me in school. And I sure know something, sure know something. No one can make me feel the way that you do. And I sure know something,
My relationship with Cher had changed my romantic life. It made me reconsider some of the basic things I'd assumed about women. It also changed my financial life. In some ways, I guess. It forced me to grow up. Before Cher, I'd never lived with anyone. Even in 1979, when we were on top of the world, I was paying $200 a month rent in New York City, and that was my full exposure financially. I didn't have a car. I didn't know how to drive and didn't want to learn. I was completely happy and was amassing a nice fortune because I wasn't spending any money. I hardly ever went shopping and had no real girlfriends to throw money at. Every once in a while, I'd splurge and ask Tavern on the Green to send food up to my apartment. But that was it. While I was with Cher, though, I got used to spending more money. In fact, all of us had more expenses. Whether they were real expenses like families or girlfriends, or childish expenses like cars. So for creative and financial reasons alike, we needed a hit. By the time of the Dynasty recording sessions, Paul was specifically trying to write a hit single, and he did. He came up with one with a guy named Desmond Child. Paul's song, I Was Made for Loving You, dovetailed nicely with what Casablanca wanted. They were hinting more strongly than ever that they wanted to have a single from Kiss. Paul embraced this idea, and I fought it slightly. Although not out of any sense of grand principle, I would sit down and try to work with Vinnie Poncia, who had come from a different school of thought, but who I liked. He had produced Ringo Starr, and he was a pop singles guy. I Was Made for Loving You had a certain driving force and a catchy melody. I didn't really see it. Paul knew it was a hit song, but it was Vinnie Poncia who pushed for us to record it.
When I heard I Was Made for Loving You being played back in the studio, I was blown away. Yeah, it wasn't Detroit Rock City or Love Gun, but it was undeniable. Another band came into the studio while it was playing and they loved it too. It was universal, something that grabbed you the first time you heard it. Was it calculated? Yeah. Was it calculated to succeed? Yes, ultimately it was. But was that a bad thing? It started as a challenge to myself to see whether I could write in that style instead of meat and potatoes rock and roll. It was no different from the challenge I gave myself with Hard Luck Woman. The only difference was the style. No apologies for a hit that people worldwide still want to hear and sing along to.
I was made for loving you, baby. You were made for loving me, and I can't get enough of you, baby. Can you get enough of me?
The show we mounted to support the release of Dynasty was no longer a rock show. It was more like HR Puffin stuff on ice. It was something that perhaps in some ways we consciously maneuvered toward. Over time, the band had evolved to include a broader demographic than in the beginning, but the change in our live presentation was just one of many missteps made at the time. We wore ridiculous outfits for the Dynasty tour, like Vegas or Disney characters jumping around in our colorful outfits. I don't consider what we normally wear to be costumes, but the clothes we wore on that tour certainly were. I had a layered lavender top. I guess the thought was that the black and silver look we'd always had was too hard-edged, so now we were going to add an individual color for each guy based on the halo color on each of our solo albums. It was horrible.
She's got the magic touch, and you're walking around in a dream. She's got the magic touch.
I had designed the stage hexagonal with elevators that brought us up to stage level. We paid a fortune for a laser curtain to ring the whole stage. We also had 2 complete stages built in anticipation of the need to leapfrog to alternating cities. We could add dates in one city while another crew erected the second stage at our next destination, allowing us to satisfy ticket demand in one place and then play the next place without an off date to tear down and rebuild the stage. Without Sean around, Bill brought in a choreographer named Kenny Ortega to try to tinker with the show. Kenny went on to work on stage shows from Michael Jackson and Cher, movies like Dirty Dancing, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and High School Musical, and the music video that some blame for killing Billy Squier's career, Rock Me Tonight. Bill also brought in a guy named Joe Gannon to work as a stage manager and direct our show like a Broadway musical.
For the Dynasty Tour 1979, I wanted to make up with bombast what we had clearly started lacking in musical precision. We made the stage much bigger with the design Paul brought in. We had elevator lifts that brought us up from under the stage, which everyone from Michael Jackson to John Bon Jovi to Garth Brooks would do later. We also had a lighting system that looked like it came out of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It could move up and down. The drums levitated higher than they ever had. We even had the front of the stage disconnect and lift the band over the heads of the people in the front rows. To up the stakes even more, I got the bright idea of having a rig built to fly me up to the light system 55 feet above the ground. Every night, I would throw up the blood that had been hidden in my mouth during the previous blackout, stand there erect and proud, and wait for the audience to give me my due. I would demand it. And although at that point I felt powerful, the feeling would quickly dissipate as I was flying straight up through the air at 6 feet a second. I was scared stiff every night, and I kept thinking to myself every time I flew up there in the dark, what an idiot I was to have got myself into this mess. At the same time the whole band was being pulled apart. The biggest problem was Peter, who was by this point becoming unhealthy, in part because of the chemicals, and certainly because he wasn't allowed to play drums. We had always been able to placate him before, but this time, under even more pressure, he became harder to control. We hadn't been away very long, only a year really, and fans had gotten plenty of music in that stretch. Alive 2, double platinum, and all 4 solo albums, all of them selling platinum. But the record label was accustomed to having 2 Kiss records each and every year because of the blistering pace that we had set through the mid-1970s. As we got ready to finish Dynasty, Bill Aucoin alerted us to the idea of a Return of Kiss campaign and told us that we were going in for a cover shoot with Scavullo, the big fashion photographer. He put us in straitjackets. We got the photos done, and they looked great. A few days later, we did a video session for a series of television commercials keyed to the same theme. That session went less smoothly. The director insisted on take after take, and the day was getting longer. Peter was especially unhappy with the way it was going, so he ran into the bathroom and started to complain. Bill Aucoin tried to calm Peter down. Peter then got so upset, either with himself or with the way things were going, and I assumed that the chemicals in his system had something to do with it, that he took his fist and smashed it into a glass case so hard that a shard went right through his hand. He had to be taken to a hospital and stitched up. Now there was a question whether there was even going to be a tour, whether Peter's damaged tendons would allow him to use his right hand at all. We were horrified. Our initial thought right away was for Peter's safety, because we lived with him and cared about him, no matter the consistent torture he put us through. But afterward, when the shock of the accident wore off, Paul and I got angry. "Oh my God," we would say, "what an idiot." Can you imagine being so upset at anything that you drive your fist through a glass case? The whole James Dean lifestyle had never appealed to me, because after that guy dies in a car crash, I'm going to sleep with his girlfriend.
Perhaps not surprisingly, the tour was in trouble from the start. It wasn't a good omen when our first show was canceled. We figured we would be doing multiple nights in most markets, but for the most part, that didn't happen. We had already had a few 2- and 3-night stands on our last tour in 1977, so what was next? More nights, obviously. Nope. Fewer. The bottom got pulled right out from under us. It was shocking and scary to see that instead of getting bigger, we were getting smaller, as it seemed people were having second thoughts about coming to see us. Why aren't they coming? We had sanitized ourselves and were well on our way to extinguishing the fire that had propelled us so far. We stayed at a hotel opposite the Forum in LA when we played there, and I looked out the window and broke out in a cold sweat because I saw so many kids and families standing in line, which at that time could only backfire on us. The line could just as easily have been for the circus. There was an upside, though. I saw a lot of apparently single moms with their kids in tow. I could tell somebody, "Blonde mom in row 3, have her and Junior come backstage after the show, and then send Junior off for a tour of the stage." But it was all wrong. Peter was completely unmanageable. Whatever we did was never right. If we let him sleep late on a day off, he would get angry and say he wanted to travel on the off day. If we traveled on an off day, he would say he wanted to sleep. If he said it was too hot backstage, we turned up the air conditioning. Then he complained it was too cold. One time he punched a mirror and got a serious deep cut on his hand that needed microsurgery and stitches. It wasn't unusual for Peter to throw his drumsticks at me or Gene or Ace if we stepped in front of his drum riser. Never mind that he was up on a drum riser, meaning we didn't block the audience's view of Peter even if we did pass in front of his kit. If he wants to be at the front of the stage, he should learn to play the damn guitar. But then one night, near the end of the tour, in December 1979, Peter had been binging on drugs and playing particularly erratically. When I turned around during one song and let him know his tempo was too frantic, his reaction was to start slowing songs down and then speeding them up again, apparently out of spite. That crossed the line. It's one thing to sabotage things offstage, and God knows he'd done plenty of that, but this was different. This was in front of fans, people who had paid to see us. Immediately after the show, Gene, Ace, and I spoke about it. We were all stunned by the betrayal. The unspoken rule had always been that you left your shit in the dressing room. No matter what was going on, when we went on stage, we were a band. The stage was sacred. Peter's purposeful sabotaging of the show was the ultimate treachery. We decided we wanted Peter gone. Ace can say whatever he wants now, but he voted to fire Peter without any prodding or strong-arming. It's a tribute to Ace that he did. As far as my own vote, I didn't think it was cold or calculated to dump Peter. It was just survival. Was I going to let his problems drag down the entire band, and me with it? No way. Gene felt the same way. We called Bill and told him we had to get rid of Peter. We said we wanted to cancel the rest of the shows and go home. How could we go on? Bill smoothed things over enough to get us to delay taking action and continue the tour rather than fire Peter immediately. We had just a few dates left. Peter didn't see the train that was about to hit him, but that was par for the course. Immediately after the end of the tour in mid-December 1979, Peter married his second wife, Deborah Jensen, a Playboy playmate. The situation was weird. I couldn't help but wonder, would she marry him if she realized she was marrying the former drummer of Kiss?
Dynasty was released, and immediately I Was Made for Loving You went to the top of the charts. It was huge, the biggest single we'd ever had worldwide. To this day, it is one of the only 2 gold singles released by Kiss. The other one is Beth. And when you have a hit single, you also have a pressure to follow it up with more singles and even more aggressive touring. A year before, the 4 of us had been feeling our way through our own lives, getting a little breathing room. Now here we were, right back in the thick of things. The tour was huge. And both Ace and Peter were so miserable they turned on each other and for a moment actually swung at each other. They both cried and fell into each other's arms afterward.
Well, the solo albums had come and gone, and it was time to do another Kiss record. And the next record was Dynasty. Dynasty was a unique record only because it was the guys getting back together again after all sorts of traumas that happened with the solo albums. And now we had to decide on a producer. Well, as it happens, the producer that finally turned out to do Dynasty was Vinnie Poncia, for a number of reasons. One, Peter had used him for a solo album, and he had refused to do the next album unless he could use Vinnie Poncia. Well, Vinnie, we all liked Vinnie a lot, and so Vinnie became the producer of record. The next thing was to find the music, and the music obviously was written by Kiss, but one song we needed to fulfill our obligations to Casablanca was a disco song. Well, none of us really wanted to do a disco song, but Casablanca had become famous for doing disco records, and Donna Summer was on the label and so forth and so on, but so we decided to do a disco record called I Was Made for Loving You, which ironically turned out to be probably the second most played single that Kiss had ever done, the first being Beth, and the second being I Was Made for Loving You, a world hit, and followed us around the world as we did the world tour. The Dynasty show turned out to be the biggest Kiss show we had ever done. It took 16 semis to travel around the United States. It was a monstrous show with a very large crew. And we put it together in Lakeland, Florida, and we finally started the show, doing the first couple of shows in Florida and then moving up the East Coast. When we get to Atlanta, I had already flown back to the offices in New York, and I got a call from the head production manager. Production manager let me know that after tonight's show, they were quitting. They were quitting because the show was too big, it should have never come on the road, and it was impossible to do. Well, I got on a plane and flew to Atlanta right away, and I came into the Omni, which was the arena that we were doing the show in, and the head production manager came over to me and said, Bill, look, this is impossible. The show just doesn't work, it's way too big, and I'm really telling you that after tonight, we're all quitting, it just can't be done. And I said, well, okay, let me think about it. And I said, we'll have a meeting to talk it over in 15 minutes. You get all your crews together. Now, knowing that I couldn't very well take the Kiss show off the road, it was costing millions of dollars to put it on, I had to find some way to get through that evening and convince people that we could do the show. So we gathered all our production crew together. And as I'm talking about the show, I started to realize that the show was obviously very big, but that no one had ever seen the show. We had rehearsed it for weeks, but it was so complicated. Each particular person had its own idea of what they had to do, but never had seen the show put together because they were too busy working on their own little departments. So I finally started explaining the show to them. Everyone looked at me with this blank stare saying, yeah, is that the way it's supposed to be? I said, well, tonight, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go through the show step by step. And at the end of the night, you'll see that this show can work and how exciting it can be and how it could stay on the road. Well, there was a lot of hemming and hawing. We went through everything about the show step by step again. We went through all the pyros, all the stage sets, every change in the show, where the music, why it was supposed to happen, what was supposed to happen in every section of the show. Everyone seemed to understand. I told them to go out and check everything out. Everyone went out and checked. We came back. We had one more meeting. Finally, that night, they got to see the show because everyone was aware of something that I had never expected during rehearsals, which was that no one ever got to see the show. And they finally saw it that night in Atlanta. It went off perfectly, and everyone decided to keep the show on the road. Now, let me tell you about some of the things that never made the show. There was a couple of laser effects that we wanted. One was a huge laser setup that was underneath the stage that at one part of the show would put laser bars completely around the stage so it would look like Kiss was in a cage, a laser cage. Well, we spent an enormous amount of money at that time. I think it costs about $150,000, $200,000 to have this one effect, which the day that we set up didn't work. And it was a horrible story, everyone complaining and everything else. And we finally had to fire the laser company, and of course everyone was a little down about that. And one of the other effects that was supposed to be part of this was a laser beam that would come out of Paul's eye. We were going to have a fiber optic cord running along with the guitar cord, and it would run up through his costume and out behind his ear, so that the laser beam would look like it's coming directly out of his eye. And it was scrapped also at the last minute because Paul was afraid it would damage his eye. So that's one effect you never got to see. Now, let's talk about one other thing. I mean, all of you know that I figured that Gene had so much presence on stage and had so much to do that I really had to balance it out by giving Paul something to do and something that would look great for him. I initially thought that we'd have Paul fly from the stage to the lighting grid, where he would sing one of his songs. And it would just fulfill that part of the show and balance off what Gene had on the other side of the stage. When I described it to Paul, he listened carefully and then told me, no, he didn't think so. He thought he'd be too scared to fly from the stage, and the wires, would they hold him? Wouldn't they hold him? There would be too many complications. Of course, the minute he said no, Gene raised his hand and said, I'll do it. As always, Gene felt anything else he could do on stage he would do, and usually did. So anyway, that was the story about how Gene finally got to fly to the lighting grid. The Dynasty tour, as I mentioned before, was a huge tour in the sense of the type of people, the stage set, and the complete show. As the show continued and as we traveled around the world, it was becoming obvious that the show was so big that unless we really sold out every show, there was not going to be a lot of money made on the tour. This became a problem at the end of the tour, certainly for me and for the group, based on the fact that their business managers at the time kept telling them they're not making money on tours. There was a lot of complications, I think, that came from this. One, this particular tour didn't sell out, probably because the Dynasty album wasn't one of their biggest selling albums. We had just done the solo albums. There was an awful lot of Kiss product out there. And although we had a hit song on the Dynasty album, which was I Was Made for Loving You, it was really bigger outside the United States than it was inside the United States. So that overall the album sales were down slightly and the attendance on the show were down, and therefore we didn't get to make the profits that certainly their business managers wanted them to make. One of the things that happened, I thought, that actually bothered Gene and Paul, as a matter of fact, was a famous interview with the Tom Snyder Show. They were excited about doing this network television show with Tom Snyder, and a little concerned about what Ace and Peter would say. And before the show, the associate producers of the show would go and interview the different people that were going to be on the show. And of course, they came and they interviewed Gene and Paul and Peter and Ace. Well, they went back with notes for Tom on all four characters, and they went something like this. Oh, Gene, very, very good talker and very bright and able to answer almost any question. Paul will answer any question, too, very communicative. And Peter's a little quiet, but okay, and Ace won't talk at all. Well, the truth of the matter is the day that they went to interview Ace, Ace was feeling pretty good, had had a few drinks, and was kind of a little out of it, so he really didn't want to do any pre-interview with any associate producer, so he basically didn't say very much, and that's the notes that got back to Tom Snyder. The day of the show, when we arrived at the NBC studios, Ace was feeling great. He had had a great day, and he was in top form. We had bought a bottle of champagne, was back in the dressing room. We had a few sips of the bottle of champagne. Ace was in true form. In any case, by the time we went and did the show that night, Ace was feeling really good, still in great shape, and in a great mood. So we went to sit down, and of course Tom started interviewing Gene and Paul first, going along with the notes from his associate producers that said that Peter and Ace probably wouldn't say very much. Ace definitely wouldn't say anything. So not to talk too much to those two characters. All of a sudden, Ace started coming alive. So Tom started looking at Ace and started asking him a few questions. Well, Ace started to burst out in laughter, and started discussing Kiss with Tom Snyder. And at the point where Gene and Paul started to give him dirty looks, well, how dare he start talking like this, and start laughing and carrying on television. Meanwhile, Tom Snyder started to think that maybe this was a joke being played on him by his staff. After all, they told him Ace wasn't going to talk at all, and now Ace was telling jokes, laughing, and discussing everything with Tom. Well, we go to commercial, and Gene comes over and says, Bill, you got to do something about Ace. You know, he's just getting carried away, and you've got to tell him to be quiet. Well, of course, I thought Ace was doing a great job. And it was a lot of fun to see him come to life, and Tom Snyder was enjoying him as well. So it really became the Ace show that night, and turned out to be maybe one of the classic interviews that Kiss ever did.